When we were in college, Heather and I were involved in a large church down in Evansville. And that church had a special service for college-aged adults. It was called The Well. And it was a very innovative service, too. It had contemporary music and was in a multi-purpose room instead of a sanctuary. Instead of rows of chairs or pews, we sat at tables. So it was a very innovative service. It was meant to cater to people in that college age, that 20-something age group. And it was also targeted at seekers, people who didn't grow up in church, people who weren't comfortable in a traditional church setting. It was a seeker-driven service. And because it was quite a bit more informal, we decided that we would bring someone we knew who was a little bit hostile to Christianity in general, didn't have a high opinion of churches. He was very, very skeptical. And here's the thing about this service. As innovative as this service was, there was one traditional element that they didn't get rid of, and that was the offering. So as the pastor was introducing the offering, our guest leaned over to us and asked, "Why are they always asking for your money?" Well, we didn't bother explaining the more spiritual side of it. We thought that wouldn't really compute to him in his state of mind, but we thought he would understand the more practical side of it. We told him that that's how the church pays its bills, and that caught him by surprise. You see, it had never occurred to him that the only source of money for a church is the donations it receives. Now, money is a sensitive topic in a church. I was joking with the Ingalls earlier that they showed up on the one Sunday in the entire time I've been here that I'm talking about money. So, and I think someone teased them and said I did that on purpose. I think it was Dave Brinson. But I promise I didn't do that on purpose. But it's a sensitive topic. You know, I've heard a lot of people complain about churches that talk about money all the time. And sure, we never want to come off as obsessed with money. Money is still a resource, though, that the church can make use of. It's something that is useful to the church. It can also be a serious stumbling block to us as individuals. Money can be one of those things that spiritual evil can use to get its hooks in us. Remember what Jesus said about money. He said, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." So it's important that we be brave enough and vulnerable enough to talk about money in church. As uncomfortable as it might be, as afraid as we might be to talk about it, it's something that's important for us to talk about, not only for the health of our church, but for our individual spiritual health. Now, a couple of questions for you. Have you ever wondered what happens to the money you put in the offering plate? Where it goes after you put it in there? Have you ever wondered why we put money in the offering plate at all? I mean, you get the practical side of things. The church has to pay its bills. But is there a spiritual side? Is there a biblical side to why we give to the church? Well, I'd like to answer these questions for you this morning. I'm going to attempt to. But frankly, this could have been a 2 or 3 week series. But with Labor Day weekend coming up next week, I wanted to make sure that as many of our church family were gathered together to hear this as possible. So you're getting in one sermon what probably could have taken 2 or 3 weeks to talk about. Well, first of all, why do we give in the first place? Where does this practice of giving come from? Well, you could trace it all the way back to Genesis 14. Around 2000 BC, a man named Abraham, you may have heard of him, won a military victory. And he received a blessing from a priest of God by the name of Melchizedek. And in response, in return for that blessing, Abraham gave that priest a tenth of the spoils that he had won through his military victory. Now, that's where the word tithe comes from, by the way. It means 1/10 or 10%. Now, centuries later, when God formed Abraham's descendants into a nation called Israel, he moved their leader Moses to institute a system of religious sacrifices. The overall purpose of this system was to make God an integral part of their everyday lives. It was to give them a way to take the unseen God and interact with him in a real and tangible way. So the system of sacrifices would go beyond that as well to reinforce certain virtues and values that God wanted to be part of his people's life, like generosity, trust in God, a sense of dependence upon God. And one part of this system was the tithe. In the book of Leviticus it says this: a tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. Now, technically, everything belongs to God. Everything we have belongs to God. As the psalmist quotes God as saying, "Every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains, and the insects in the fields are mine." So what we call ours is only ours because God entrusted it to us. We're stewards. We're special servants who've been entrusted with our Master's wealth to manage his household. Now, he lets us have 90% of it to take care of ourselves and our families and to be generous with. But he asks that 10% be invested in the religious life of the community. Now, by the way, 10% was the minimum for the ancient Israelite. If you look at the first 6 chapters of Leviticus, you can read about 5 different types of offerings that the Israelites made on top of their tithe. Some were optional, some were required. The tabernacle and the temple, the 2 places of worship in the Old Testament, were built using materials donated by the people. So the Israelites gave for special purposes all the time, but their regular routine giving was in the form of a tithe. Now you might be thinking, but wait, that's all from the Old Testament. And there are a lot of things we don't do from the Old Testament. I had a shrimp cocktail for dinner last night and bacon for breakfast this morning. True, we don't maintain some of the practices from the Old Testament. Some things in the Old Testament were fulfilled by Jesus and are no longer necessary. Some things got replaced by other things. Some things were specific to the ancient Israelites. But there are plenty of things that carry over into the New Testament, and tithing is one of those things. How do we know? Well, there was this one time that Jesus was giving the religious leaders of his day a tongue lashing, as he was known to do, and he said this: "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness." Now, the criticism here is that these religious leaders are giving their tithe, but they're neglecting God's moral expectations. But pay close attention to what he says next. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. In other words, obey God's moral law, obey God's moral expectations, but remember to tithe. Remember to give so that the religious life of the community can be maintained. So here we have Jesus affirming the importance of tithing. And by the way, in case it needs to be said, back then wealth was measured by land, livestock, and crop yields. Today wealth is mostly represented by money. We tithe dollars and cents, they tithe bulls and grain. So that's why we put money in the plate, but what happens to it next? What happens after it goes in the offering plate? Where does it go? How does it get spent? Well, allow me to tell you what happens to it around here. It gets counted by volunteers who have been appointed by our finance committee. Evelyn Hamilton, our financial secretary, categorizes what's received based on where it's supposed to go. You see, there are 4 basic pots of money for our church that tithes and offerings go into. The 2 that are managed by the church office are the general budget fund and the special or designated funds. Now, the Missions Committee has their own accounts, and they're managed by Treasurer Alice Parrish. The trustees have their own accounts, and they're managed by Treasurer Don Taylor. Anything that isn't designated for a specific purpose funds our general budget. Anything that's designated for a specific purpose goes into designated funds where it's tracked until it's used or distributed. At the end of each month, any designated funds that need to be are distributed, and these are usually funds that go into either missions or trustees. Now, the general budget is the main way we meet our expenses of our church. Every fall, the Finance Committee looks at the giving for the current year and tries to predict how much we can expect to receive in the new year. Based on that number, the committee comes up with a plan for how much of that income will go towards certain purposes. Salaries, utility bills, office supplies, sheet music, AV equipment, curriculum, whatever expenses we have as we go about the business of the church. That budget gets recommended to the charge conference, which is held by our administrative council every fall, and it's charge conference that gives the final approval. And then with that budget as a guide, the church staff makes purchases and pays the bills. Stephanie, our administrative assistant, prints the checks. Our treasurer, Becky Pedigo, reviews those checks and signs off on them. And by the way, notice the separation of responsibilities. No one person is doing more than one step in that process. There's a reason for that. We trust each other, but it's trust with accountability, so that we can make sure that guidelines are being followed, so that we can maintain a sense of trust and integrity. But you might be wondering, is there anything in the Bible that tells us how the money from the tithes should be spent? Well, let's take a look at how the Israelites used the tithe in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy, Moses reminds the people, be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. So in other words, use your tithe to facilitate worship. Use your tithe to enable the religious life of the community. Every 3 years, a special tithe was taken that went 100% to a specific purpose. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless and the widows who live in your towns, may come and eat and be satisfied, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So the tithe also went to support the Levites. Now the Levites were those whose job it was to serve in the place of worship. They were the ones who were responsible for maintaining and overseeing the religious life of the community. And that practice would continue into the New Testament. We read there that Paul wrote, the elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For Scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Why? So that the ox can nibble at the grain if he gets hungry. And the worker deserves his wages. Now, the term elder that you saw used in that passage was an ancient term for a pastor in the early church. So in both the Old and the New Testaments, those responsible for overseeing the religious life of the community lived off a portion of the tithe. Lastly, those who were in need and who had no other options, the orphans and the widows, they also benefited from a portion of the tithe. So we see this in the New Testament as well. In his letters to the church in Corinth, Paul refers to a collection taken for those in need in Jerusalem. So there are the three things the tithe was used for. The religious life of the community, to provide a living for those who oversee that religious life, and to provide for those in need. Now, for us, the religious life of the community is a broad category. For us, that covers everything that we need as a church, from the electric bill to the music the choir sings to the paper your bulletins are printed on. And while everyone serves the church in some capacity, the church has 3 paid employees, 2 of whom depend significantly on what the church pays them for a living. Now, most of the assistance that we provide people in need in our church comes from designated giving or other sources rather than from the general budget. But a significant portion of our general budget goes to help people too. When we provide funeral dinners, outreach events, or we support the global ministries of the United Methodist Church, those portions of the tithe are going to help people in need. So the tithe that you place in the offering is being spent as the Bible prescribes. It funds the religious life of the community. It provides a living for those who oversee that religious life, and it goes to help those in need. But one thing that's important to keep in mind about the general budget is that a budget is not money in the bank. It's just a plan. It's a plan of how we will spend what we think will come in over the course of the year. In any kind of nonprofit that includes churches, you walk a fine line when it comes to money. You don't want to be wasteful, but at the same time, you don't want to be afraid to spend money if it benefits the organization. And a budget is a good tool to help you maintain that balance. Still, we have to keep a close eye on how much money is actually coming in. The budget's based on an educated guess. It isn't until the money starts coming in that we actually know what we're working with. This year, we tried communicating with you how all that was going with the report that you see on the back of the bulletin. We set a monthly goal of $16,269. That's 1/12 of our annual budget. That's our annual budget divided by 12. And the idea was that if we reached that goal every month, our budget would be fully funded. But we kept track if we ever fell short of that monthly goal, and the accumulated shortfall January through July was $16,020.51. Sounds bad, but the reality is that the Finance Committee met just a couple of weeks ago, and they reviewed our finances. And what they determined is that the church is actually financially healthier than it's been in some time. Yes, we're behind on where we wanted to be in funding our budget for regular giving, but there were other sources of income we hadn't accounted for. Not to mention our expenses probably aren't going to add up to what we thought they were going to be when we made the budget. That said, if just in case they are as expensive as we thought, please keep giving. You never know what's coming up down the line. Another thing that emerged out of that conversation was the need for a better way to report our church's financial situation in that little report on the back of the bulletin. And that's the insert that you see in your bulletin. If you take a look at that, please, I'd like to explain to you what you're looking at here. It's a simpler way to look at the financial state of the church. The purple line, the one at the bottom, represents how far we've gone through the year, the percentage of the year that is behind us already. But more importantly, look at the red and the green lines. The red line represents the percentage of the budget that has been spent so far this year. The green line represents the percentage of the budget that has been funded by your giving. Ideally, the green line would be at least flush with the red line, if not ahead of it. If the green line is ahead of the red line, it means we're bringing in money faster than we're spending it, which is a good thing. So as long as the green line is at least even with the red line, if not ahead of it, we're on target. If the green line slips behind the red line, it means we're having to, it means that we're probably needing to either step up our giving or we're needing to make some budget cuts. But as you can see, we're doing okay. The income's staying ahead of the giving. So we're hoping to show you this report on a regular basis. We're still working on how regular, but as long as the green line's ahead of the red line, we're good. Simple enough? Okay. Well, I know that I gave you a lot this morning, and I know it's a lot of talk about money. But remember, money is a resource that the church can use to spread God's kingdom, to build God's kingdom, to change lives, to change communities, to change the world. And so we have to be able to talk about it. And as far as us as individuals go, money is a big deal in our lives personally. That's why it's a very sensitive topic, because it is significant personally to us in our lives. And something that is of that great significance in our lives has a spiritual impact on us too, has spiritual implications for our lives as well. So we need to be making sure that our use of this valuable resource is done in a way that honors the God who it really belongs to in the first place. And giving to the faith community, investing in the faith community, is an integral part of what it means to be faithful with what God gives us.